Good evening and namaskar. On behalf of Amity School of Communication, our advisor, Professor Colonel R.K. Dargan, my esteemed colleague, Dr. Pallavi Majumdar, I extend a very warm welcome to all the attendees of today's session. We also acknowledge the presence of dignitaries, worthy faculty members from Noida and different campuses of Amity, and also from other universities across the globe who have come all the way to listen to this lecture, although it is online. We also welcome the most precious of all, our young students. And as you're all aware, Amity University was one of the first educational institutions which took lead in an uninterrupted learning cycle, in spite of the trying times that the COVID pandemic unleashed. Under the leadership of the Chancellor, Dr. Atul Chauhan, and the guidance of Vice Chancellor, Professor Balvinder Shukla, the Amity fraternity, in the true spirit laid by our founder, Dr. Ashok Chauhan, rose up to the occasion and in fact created an ecosystem where we are privileged to interact with the giants of the world through technology, through our, in our lockdown lives. And ASCO, as you know, Amity School of Communication is one of the topmost media training institutions in the country. We are a strong team which believe in training young minds and giving them a latitude of knowledge from which they can pick their own pathways. And as of now, I would now like to introduce today's guest. It is very rare to meet a person with knowledge, humility, a large heart, an ability to mentor and encourage young followers, and last of all, have a great sense of humor. I introduce to you the esteemed guest for today's panel, someone we've been indeed very lucky to have met early this year during the ICAM conference. The house, as some of us know, is always enamored by his magic and his ability to make complex concepts seem so familiar and simple. Professor Arvind Singhal. Professor Singhal is a Samuel Shirley and Edna Holt Marston Endowed Professor of Communication and Director of the Social Justice Initiative at the University of Texas at El Paso. He is also appointed as the William J. Clinton Distinguished Fellow at the Clinton School of Public Service, University of Little Rock. He is the Distinguished Visiting Professor at Inland School of Business and Social Sciences, Norway, and our Chancellor's Honorary Professor at Amity University, India. Today, Professor Singhal will be sharing with us insights on Mahatma Gandhi, the topic being Mahatma is the message, what Gandhi teaches us about communication praxis. I now request my co-moderator, Dr. Pallavi, to also share some, a few opening remarks and initiate the conversation. Welcome, Professor Singhal and Dr. Pallavi.
Thank you, Dr. Gauri. And indeed, very grateful, Professor Singhal, that you're here with us today on this platform. When Gandhi was assassinated on 30th of January 1948, he was a private citizen without wealth, property, official title, achievement, or artistic gift. And sir, I'm taking the liberty to quote from you here, not a commander of armies, no sporting prowess, an unimpressive public speaker. Balding, bespectacled, brown, he was barely 5 feet 5 inches tall. And yet, he was a giant of a man. And that brings us to, I'm sure everybody who joined in today's panel would be very, very curious to know about why this sustained interest in the Mahatma. Why are we revisiting Gandhi after so many decades and years and days over and over again?
Well, thank you, Gauri and Pallavi. It warms my heart to reach out across the oceans to all our friends who are on the call, especially, I think, to the students, but aren't we all? We are all students. So why this sustained interest in the Mahatma? I think for me, it's been a very personal quest. Maybe there are some professional intertwined strains to it. when you grow up in India, the first generation to be born in a free India, my parents were both born pre-independence. I think you have a certain sensibility. You hear about the Rashtrapita. He becomes a little familiar when you begin to call him Bapu. And you hear stories from, when you take a morning walk with your grandfather, he tells you the story of how Gandhi, when there was a school inspector who was visiting, misspelled the word kettle. And, his teacher said, this is the right way to spell it. And he sort of declines to change it. You become enamored. And, so I think the interest in Gandhi in a sort of an amorphous way came to me very personally. I do have some personal memories which I think are important to highlight here. In 1971, when I was 9 years old, I remember arriving at Ahmedabad train station with my mother. And, ordinarily we take a rickshaw or we take a tanga or, whatever. But this time there was a car that had come to pick us up, and it was a big car with a flag on it. And I remember, my mother and I sat in it, and it drove to Raj Bhavan, which is where we were staying. So I'm realizing as my mother's telling me that we are going to visit with her uncle, Chachaji, whom I'd never seen before. He was a busy man, and my parents lived in West Bengal. So, our paths had never crossed. And his name was Babu Sriman Narayan. And at that time, he was the governor of Gujarat. And when he was about 25 years old, he joined Bapu in Sevagram. In fact, he also is the son-in-law of Jamna Lal Bajaj, who you may know, gave the land to Gandhiji near Wardha so that he could start Sevagram. So here I am meeting my mother's chacha, my Nanaji, for the first time. And it's still early in the morning. And as I'm introduced to him and as I bow and touch his feet, I realize that he is sitting on the floor wearing his khadi, and he's grinding wheat, with the grinder. And later, of course, the atta that was produced was made into prasad and was circulated to all of us. And it was during that visit to Ahmedabad, I remember first going to the Sabarmati ashram, having a little conversation with my Nanaji, why he's the governor, why is he sitting on the floor, and why is he, doing all this. So those kinds of intriguing episodes, happenstance, and that was the first and the last time that I met him, because he then died in a heart attack in a train. So I have been in some ways sort of a seeker it's easier to connect the dots in reverse. But I found myself the first time I was in Johannesburg in South Africa looking for the Empire Theatre, where in 1906, September 11th, he, had the first meeting to propose a satyagraha. I remember going to the Hamidia mosque in Johannesburg, where in a cauldron, they first burnt the passes. I think that was in 1908 with Jan Smuts and the Asiatic law. So I've sort of been on a pilgrimage. Every time I'm in Delhi, I like to go to Gandhi, Smriti, and Birla House, the place where he was shot and assassinated. I remember having a very beautiful moment at Pietermaritzburg station. This is the place where he was thrown off a moving train when he was 23, his first week in South Africa, and so on. So it's a deeply personal quest, but of course, as you become interested in social change, as you become interested in social mobilization, as you become interested in symbols, you realize that here is not just, a Rashtrapita or a Bapu or a Mahatma, but he was a giant of a man in terms of our discipline of communication.
Also, sir, whenever I've listened to you about Gandhi, I've noticed that you've been lucky to imbibe or be introduced to him in, in a very different way. Why do you think, students of today, like Pallavi said, after decades, Gandhi will appear as somebody to understand, as communication scholars, with, in terms of engaging with audiences. So if you were to place the relevance of Gandhi today, how would you do that, sir?
Oh, again, I can answer this question, which is a beautiful question, at a very deeply personal and professional level. And since you said, for students, and let's say these are students of communication or social work or, interested in social change and activism, I think Gandhi's life is a khazana, is a treasure. He represents, in my opinion, even though he wore virtually no clothes and an ordinary coarse dhoti made of handspun, really a very polished diamond in an intellectual frame. And I think all you need to do, I can answer this question in many ways, but you can just look at the Salt March. Why should we be interested in Gandhi today? 1930, the narrative frame is salt. You say, why salt? Well, because voluntarily living like a poor man, as he did, to identify not with, the few middle class, upper middle class lawyers or doctors or educators in Mumbai and Delhi. He identifies with, he calls himself a farmer, a weaver. And he knows that salt is one commodity that the poor need more than the rich. And as we know, the British taxed a whole host of things. They taxed tea here in the US, and in some ways the Boston Tea Party was, and it was Indian tea, which was thrown in Boston Harbor, which led to the, the revolution here in this country. So Gandhi makes a very, he's a lawyer, he's a very, he's trained. And with his experiences in South Africa, he basically writes a legal brief to Lord Irwin. And the brief is the following. It says, dear brother, because he believed that preserving the dignity of the oppressor was critical. You never put them down. You can make the injustice visible, but you address them as dear brother. He says, dear brother, I honestly, with all my heart, ask you to repeal the salt tax in India, because as you know, the British controlled the production, the distribution, the manufacturing of salt and collected. So he basically said, I'd like you to repeal the salt tax, because salt, exists naturally. Everybody needs it, no matter whether you're Hindu or Muslim or Brahmin or Kshatriya, man or woman, young or old. And so that universality of experience embodied in the salt. And then saying that salt is one commodity that the poor need more than the rich. And by taxing salt, the British government, which sort of had a sense, maybe somewhat misplaced, of moral righteousness, that by taxing salt, you're placing a differential burden, a heavier burden on the poorest of the poor. And so the rhetorical frame and the argument, is beautiful. And of course, Irwin is like, salt, he's going to take us on salt, let him. And what is he going to do? And, then he says, well, and he always disclosed his intentions in advance. There were no surprises. He would say, if you should deny this, my brother, then I have to let you know that I'm going to walk to Dundee and I'm going to, breach the salt laws. And the walk to Dundee is very carefully charted, 240 miles, over 400 kilometers. You don't get there in a day. It's a walk. You're connected to the ground. He starts out with 78 trained satyagrahis. And, over 24 days, he invites the world's media to cover him, the local media. And while he's walking to Dundee, there are numerous salt marches organized in other localities. India has a 6,000 kilometer, coastal line. So you can think of, and this is all very beautifully. And, the slogan, one sentence which he scribbled was, I want the world's support for this fight of might against right. And, he's talking about the rights of 400 million people. And while the Salt March is ongoing, the millions of charkhas, the spinning wheels that are spinning. And, then you say, well, why charkhas? And we know that it was, very important to Gandhi, the notion of productive labor. The Indian textile industries were decimated by the British with the steam engine and, the Industrial Revolution. And so, at least you can with dignity manufacture your own cloth. It was productive labor. Also, you could wear it in some ways, the cloth that you made, you could wear it with dignity. There were thousands of prayer meetings as he, there were several times that there were the contingent that was walking with him was 2 or 3 miles long, not for all the 240 miles. And so if you wanted to make the injustice visible over 24 days with the media reporting, and you're shifting not just the public opinion in this country, in the days with no TV, with no internet, radio, which barely existed. And so just the brilliance of that approach, I mean, it's a treasure. So, and I've just talked about one little salt march. When the kettles in the coastal towns of India began to take in seawater and were boiling seawater, basically the foundations of the British Empire were shaking. And it was soon thereafter that he, go ahead.
Yes, absolutely. So, you talked about this entire spectacle that Gandhi created during the salt satyagraha. And even when Indian students, and even in fact internationally, they study about the history of press, there is this rhetorical question that comes up, who came first? Was it Gandhi, the journalist, or Gandhi, the freedom fighter? So it was not just writings, weren't they? As in, he was the editor of 6 publications, but his messaging was much more than what he wrote about. So his persona, would you like to elaborate a little on how he became the quintessential communicator?
Yeah, I mean, his persona. So, he goes to London, he's wearing top hats and, stiff collars. He comes back to India, he tries to make a career in Bombay. He is shipped off to South Africa for a few weeks. He's still in his garb. He travels first class because he's an attorney at law. Then gradually this transformation, right? I mean, Gandhian life is incremental transformation in the way I read it. And so if you read, the story of my experiments with truth, these are just, it didn't happen overnight. He built this persona as life moved on, because he, when he was shivering in Pietermaritzburg station in a very cold night for 8 hours, wondering about why he was thrown out, that stirred something in him. And, it's interesting that the friends of mine in South Africa, and I think somebody's written about this, who say that you gave us a lawyer, a 23-year-old lawyer, and 20 years later, we gave you a Mahatma. Because, by the time he returned to India in 1915, he was very well established as a Mahatma. And, personas are sort of like brands. And again, you can connect the dots more in reverse. He, authentically, I think, embodied, lived, and reinforced his persona, his brand in his daily actions. There was complete consistency between message and the messenger. His ashram was called Seva Gram, which is selfless service. It was located in the hottest, right in the middle of India. That wasn't by accident. Geographically speaking, if you look at the coordinates, but it was the hottest place in India with, no air conditioners and coolers. There wasn't even a post office, they had to set it up and so on. So he consciously cultivated this persona, not because he was being a brand publicist, but because, that was him, that was his incremental journey, a life of voluntary simplicity, consistent with this Hindu principle of aparigraha. It meant traveling third class. It meant no unnecessary expenditures, hard manual labor. And, Churchill in some ways was right. He was a half-naked fakir. Yes, from a British point of view, he got under people's skin as nobody. So I think the key was that his persona was not directed at, in his later life, in the last 50 years, was not directed at corporations or not directed at the wealthy. Motilal Nehru, when he says, "Why are you taking my son away? You've got him under your spell." And this is, of course, referring to Jawaharlal Nehru. And Gandhiji says, "Well, now I have him, and now I want to have you and all your family," and so on. So he's a very interesting life. It's a very interesting life. And it's a life that needs to be keenly observed. And, I'm just beginning to do it in some ways.
So, but I'd like to bring you back to the Dundee March, because over those 24 days, it almost seems like this strategy which unreveals itself. The people increase, the notice of journalists comes into play. The British don't expect that just for salt, this congregation will be of thousands. And then, there's also inclusivity of, in the sense that women are part of it.
Yes.
So it's an entire community engaging. और हिंदुस्तान में सर ये भी कहते हैं आपका नमक खाया है, so namak also has that reference.
It does.
And so communication, strategists, I think in terms of the Dundee March itself, there's so much, to gain on how networking, for knowing that you have to invite, journalists, gain the attention.
Absolutely. And, Gandhi was, anytime how do you make an injustice invisible? Oh, I'm sorry, how do you make an injustice which is invisible visible? You do it by, inviting people who are scribes, And so when he, at the Hamidia Mosque in Johannesburg, in the cauldron, when they burnt their passes, he had very carefully invited several dozen journalists. And, so because most people didn't know, why would, okay, there's the Asiatic Act and, why should they burn passes? Or, when the Dundee March was happening, you can imagine, people in Britain didn't really know, that their government taxed salt. And, it's like, why is Gandhi marching? And, children are writing essays on, this man who's marching. Why is he marching? He's taking on the might of the British Empire. And we know that, the sun never set on the British Empire. And why is he doing that? Because, we have the audacity to tax salt, and what's his argument? The poor need it more. So he was able to create the conditions very strategically. I mean, the Salt March was thought of. I mean, it was 60 years of work, which came into play. And, his Satyagraha movements in South Africa, from 1906 to 1914, when he left, 8 years, going to prison. Little is known, but, his son Harilal and what was the name of his first one? Anyway, his two elder sons were in prison numerous times. So there was a lot that came before Dundee. Dundee was a culmination in some ways, because he wanted to make, it was time in some ways he didn't feel that India was ready, but, from Champaran in 1916 to 1930, the conditions had been laid for him to go that far.
So I think also in communication, we talk about who are we talking to? And,
Sure.
Gandhi, in the sense of research, right from Champaran to the Dundee and later, his research on his, the people who follow him or the country as such, or the agenda was so honest. He went around the country traveling just to know who are today we talk of fancy terms, to understand who we are when we use mass communication mediums. But look at this man who, really penetrates the country to understand the pulse of what people are thinking, to be one of them.
True, yeah.
And the train journey.
Yeah.
Train journey where he travels with everybody else. True. No privilege, nothing.
Yeah, I mean, the favorite story that I often tell is that, when he was often asked, why do you travel third class? Bapu, Gandhiji, why, we as a country can do better. The president here in the US travels by something that's called Air Force One. And here's Bapu traveling third class. And, his response was always the same. I travel third class because, as you know, there's no fourth class. And this whole notion of the fourth class is not something which is a fancy idea, part of his, magnetic persona, but it's very deep. It's an understanding of Tolstoy, whom he was deeply inspired by, or John Ruskin, his work on Unto This Last, or, the work of Henry David Thoreau. He read voraciously. And, he loved being in prison in part because, it gave him an opportunity to read and so on. So this was a very a critical mind which simplified his life and simplified his ideas around a few things, but he was very consistent. And when you're consistent over a 50-year period and you're constantly on the journey of self-improvement, which he was, right? Then, others around you begin to flock around you. And I think that's his ethos, the credibility, the moral authority. Even when I was, planning to come into my study this morning, oh, this is a conversation on Gandhiji, so I had to wear a white shirt, not a flashy red one. And I had to wear a home hand-spun, churidar, just because, it is Gandhi. Nobody could really lie to him. And I think that is because of he being one, and authentically one, not just for a minute or for 5 minutes.
Yeah, so I must share with you that that's the reason I wore homespun sari. I mean, that's the reason. I could have chosen something else, but this was about Gandhi. So I also want to ask you that at least when I was growing up, I wasn't lucky as you were. To me, there were two very diverse views of Gandhi that friends and family were giving. And I really wish that at that moment, I would have been able to maybe read a text, talk to somebody who would have given me a glimpse of this person. To me, he was always enigmatic. And it's also, when you grow in life, the Gandhian philosophy makes so much sense. it's like Buddhist philosophy. It starts making sense as you grow older. So for all the young audiences who are part of this conversation, if you had to recommend that, start this journey, to me it happened because I went to Seva Ashram. But if you had to start this journey, how would you, what would be your way to, inspire them, or kind of just give them like some way to reach this colossal philosophy?
Okay, well, I can only provide my ideas, and I'm sure Gandhiji would have said, don't just listen to him, but you make up your own mind. So, I mean, if you're talking about the young people, I may begin by, I would invite them to watch some TED Talks and some really fine lectures delivered by Rama Chandra Guha. And, he, I think, has written the twin volume biography of Gandhi. Gandhi Before India, which is 700 pages. I don't know if the students will get there, or, Gandhi, Years That Changed the World, which is after he arrived in India, which is about 1100 pages. I mean, if you have I think it puts Gandhi in the time that he was. I remember maybe as a 17 or 18-year-old laying my hands on Louis Fisher's book, The Life of Mahatma Gandhi, which really, which is looked upon as a fairly important piece of work, because he actually spent time with Gandhi in his ashram. So Louis Fisher, Fischer, and he himself, if you want to read him, you've got Hind Swaraj, came out in 1910, and is at least a compilation of his ideas. Then you can read the stories of my experiment with truth. I also think you could try to understand Gandhi through others who've written about him. Mahadev Desai, who died very young, but who was very close to Gandhi, his personal secretary, his son, Narayan Desai, they've written extensively. So if you just want to go the Hollywood way, Richard Attenborough's Gandhi is 11 Oscars, and he begins by saying no life can be captured on celluloid in a few hours, but it's I think a very fine representation in a popular sense of Gandhian ideas. I also like one of the people whom I work with very closely in India is Firoz Abbas Khan. Firoz, while he's doing plays, Broadway type musicals in India like Mughal-e-Azam and others, but he made a beautiful film, in my opinion, called Gandhi, My Father. And it won a national award. It's a beautiful film because it shows the complexity of Gandhi's life. Here you are, father of the Indian nation. When Kasturba was once asked, how many children do you have? She said, I have 4, but he has 400 million. And he had a very complex relationship with his children, especially his first 2. He became a father when he was 18. So I think Gandhi, My Father, shows the complexity in some ways of a man who is a Mahatma, but also a Bapu, a father, and how, he chooses to send somebody else to study in England, as opposed to his son who really wanted to go there, and so on. So those would be, also Eknath Easwaran, he wrote a beautiful book. I think it's just simply called Gandhi the Man. I often use it as a sort of a text in my classes. It's an accessible book with some beautiful stories. I can go on.
Thank you, Professor Singhal, for sharing those very interesting readings. And that just reminded me that in terms of cultural sensibilities, Rajkumar Hirani's Munna Bhai series did so well. that it seemed as if the youth were able to identify with the Gandhian philosophy.
Very true. You may see on my left shoulder Bapu sitting, and he very much looks like the Munna Bhai Bapu. And I think he brought Gandhi home, right, for a young generation in some ways,
Yes.
through these irascible characters, right? Munna Bhai and I forget the name of his sidekick.
Circuit.
Circuit, exactly. And it's a brilliant movie, I think. And there was a whole movement in India with Gandhigiri, right? And there, of course, you get into the importance of writings and literature and, popular culture in terms of the possibilities that they present. Yeah.
So, Pallavi, I think there's some questions that are coming, and so if you permit, can I possibly ask them? Because there's this beautiful question being asked by a student, and let me just read it through. Abhishek, I'm hoping that's a student. Forgive me if I'm wrong. Was Bapu a saint who strained into politics, or was he a politician who was perceived as a saint?
Yeah, these either-or questions, it's a beautiful question, and I wish I could say it's this or that. It would be injustice to the question for me to just say it's this or that. He was a life in motion, and I often use the metaphor of the charkha to talk about a Gandhian life, because it stood on pillars, pillar of humanity. A charkha has to have a very sound foundation. It has two wheels, and the pillar of morality, and morality and action, and there's constant praxis as the charkha moves, and there's a constant churning of action and reflection. As my story of my experiments with truth is an example of that. And for him, the ends and the means, there had to be consistency there. So Gandhian life, even though it's so keenly observed, defies a simple explanation, I think.
Thank you so much, sir. So there's one question by Professor Durgan, and
Yes.
sir is, it's put in a very interesting way. Sir was just got a call from a young friend, and as soon as he said that he's listening to you, the young friend has mentioned this. The question is that, why is Gandhi only like on currency notes right now? Let's say, for example, there was during the lockdown, the government decides to do a telecast of some old mythologicals like Mahabharata. And it's a reminder of our culture, but for the new millennials. But why did not the state think of something on Gandhi, for example? I think, again, a fascinating question.
Yeah, I think, and also, the political sensibilities, right? I mean, he's a highly political figure. And I think in the ethos of India, and, we know that Gandhiji was shot by Nathuram Godse. So here's a Hindu who took his life, and he was very inspired by certain Hindu leanings, because he thought that, Bapu was too lenient and too conciliatory to his Muslim brothers. And so I'm not surprised in some ways that the state chose not to. If I were there, maybe I would have thought otherwise. But that that doesn't preclude any of us, whether we are doing courses. I mean, we teach about this and that. For us to talk about Gandhi, for private operators to do so. So I think he's a very misunderstood figure as well, because most of us, we know him as, oh yeah, somebody who did something to bring us independence. But the passage of time, in some ways, for me, the passage of my time is he has come closer. But I think with the passage of time, for most people, he moves further away, because the here and the now becomes more important than what happened in the past. But yeah, it's a good question. And Gandhiji would always say, forget about what the state's going to do, or what are you going to do?
Very true, sir. So, our faculty member Apurva, and I think again a very interesting question. If Gandhiji were born in the digital age, how he would have channelized the people to go for Swaraj 2.0?
Hi, Apurva. I think I know Apurva.
Yes,
He's the one who manages your 2.0, right? For MIT? Yeah.
Great memory, sir.
Yeah. She was the one who presided over the honorary professorship ceremony. So yes, Apurva, I can see you utter that. I don't know. I mean, the simple answer is I don't know how he would do it. Whatever he'd do it with dignity. I mean, he was a product of his time, and he was driven, as I said, by higher aspirations for himself as a person, I think the Mahatma will still be the message, and we know the complexity of his whole life. When he was asked, Bapu, what message do you have for the world? He said, no message. No, my life is my message. And I think, however that translates to Swaraj 2.0 would be interesting. But here it's important, for us to make, and as I read Gandhi, and before him was Tilak, right? And Tilak, based in Pune, edited Kesari, the publication, and Swaraj for Tilak, as he talked about it, was home rule, was freedom from the British. I think for Gandhi, Swaraj was more Swaraj, rule over self. And it's an important distinction. I mean, he was for home rule, but before he said home rule, we should be worthy of home rule. And in order to be worthy, you have to rule over yourself. And if you are a believer in satyagraha, and if you are a believer in ahimsa, you need a daily discipline to rule over yourself. So the charkha spinning or the grinding of the atta may be a menial, boring task, but that is how you purify yourself to be worthy of Swarajya. So it's really interesting. So Gandhian sensibilities would come into play, Apurva, I think, for a 2.0 version.
Okay, Professor Singhal, there's another interesting question from a colleague, Rubed, would like to ask you that if you were to ask Gandhi one question, what would it be?
Oh, it's interesting. When Barack Obama became president in 2009, and he was visiting a school in Arlington, Virginia, a 9th grader asked him a question. Her name was Lily, and she said, Mr. President, if you had the choice of having dinner with one person, dead or alive, whom you could bring into the White House, and who would it be? And Mr. President Obama, without batting an eyelid, he said, of course it'll be Gandhi. It'll be Mahatma Gandhi. And then of course he says, I know it's going to be a very small and simple meal. So anyway, so this is a good question. What question would I ask him? I think the question I would ask him is, what's the question that we should ask ourselves as we journey in our own lives? And I'd be very, he probably won't answer it. He'd say you'd have to go discover it for yourself. But yeah, I'd like to, but I think he would respect the question. And so my question would be, what question do you think a person like me should be asking? But I'm quite sure he won't answer it.
That's a tough question.
Which is an answer, right?
Right.
And Pallavi, we have a question from Dr. Ruchita Chaudhary, and she's from Lucknow. And
Oh,
so
yeah.
she's asking how Gandhiji's educational philosophy is relevant in today's world.
You know, at a fundamental philosophical level, I think he's so vital and important. So, you know, the reason why he bought his Phoenix farm in Durban, 1901 or 2, I can't remember. I've been to the Phoenix farm in Durban, where in 1903 he started the Indian opinion. The reason was because he was getting involved in, let's say, appeals and petitions and so on. He felt that, for his own growing children and other children of, sort of the would-be satyagrahis, there wasn't a place for them to, in a very white South Africa, and so the Phoenix farm, in some ways, was education, right, for the uninitiated. So you worked, you woke up at a certain time and you worked in the fields with your bare hands, and then you had instruction, and Gandhi was often the instructor. And so it was very practical, so I think he was for education, but he was for education of a somewhat different kind. I think for him, the notion of not just cultivating habits of the head, right, which is what education, I think, mostly is in these days, especially in institutions of higher learning. I think Amity has a wonderful focus on going beyond that. And we need that, right? You also have to create the conditions, as His Holiness the Dalai Lama, who loved Gandhiji, would say, that you also have to have institutions of, higher learning or schools that also cultivate habits of the heart, cultivate habits of the spirit and habits of the body. So I think Gandhi is very, very relevant. We have moved on, though, right? I mean, we think that, unless you have a paper and a pen, and unless you have a computer and a screen, and unless you can solve problems, I think he was more for a more holistic sense of education. And so he challenges us, I think. Are we educating ourselves in terms of what we know, or, is that, for him, it's not information driven. It's more wisdom which comes from within, which only can come if you cultivate these various habits. I mean, it's that journey, right? We sent you a lawyer, a trained lawyer from London, and we give you a Mahatma. How do you become a Mahatma? You don't become a Mahatma by going to school, in the traditional sense.
So, if I'm correct, he visited Shanti Niketan, isn't it? If I'm correct.
I believe so, yes, he did.
And his relationship with Tagore has so much, in terms of this whole educational praxis, the delivery. To me, what you feel for Gandhi, I've always felt for Tagore. And, when they, it's like this dynamism when they do meet, whenever they meet. The conversation that takes place, the text that you read is just incredible.
Yeah.
I think, Gauri, another related question, since we are talking about education, is that how can the Gandhian model of communication be used to educate people regarding sanitation and hygiene, especially amongst the underprivileged during this COVID-19 pandemic? What are the key principles that we can learn from Gandhi's approach?
Well, the symbol of the Swachhata campaign in India is Gandhiji's Anak, and rightly so. The first time he attended a meeting of the Congress working party, in the morning he was discovered cleaning toilets, and that was, that was a sort of a daily habit. And cleanliness is next to godliness. So he exemplified that. And I'm not sure who cleaned the toilets in Raj Bhavan in Ahmedabad. Probably, or how many of us clean our own toilets. So I think it's, again, that question can be asked of each of us. How far are we willing to go ourselves? And it's easy to say, what meaning does this have but I think it really begins here. There's a beautiful story. It's not a Gandhian story, but I often share that in some of my classes. And I say that, imagine a 70-year-old man or a woman reflecting back on his or her life, and begins by saying, when I was 20 years old, I wanted to change the world. That's who we are. And by the time I was 30, I realized that the world was too big a place, too complex a place for me to try to change. So, I'll just work on my country. And, then by the time I'm 40, I realized that my country, oh Lord, India, US, too big, too complex a place to try to change. So let me work on my city. And, then by the time I'm 50, it's like, my city, Delhi, oh Lord, El Paso, so maybe I should work on my neighborhood. And, then by the time you're 60, it's like my neighborhood, places that I know, people who I know, very complex, very difficult. So maybe I should work on my family. And then by the time you're 70 years old, you realize that family, people whom you know, most intransigent people that you could have. So then you realize, maybe I should work on myself. And then you begin to flip that story. What happens when you begin to work on yourself at 20, cleaning the toilets? Maybe by the time you're 30, people in your family, by the time you're 40, people in your neighborhood. So it's a long journey. And I think a question such as this, which is deeply important, defies a simple answer. Because as Gandhiji would say, where are you in the picture?
Very true. So Pallavi, maybe I'll combine two questions. We have the head of the English department conveying her gratitude to you. She's really enamored, and a lot of takeaways. And there are two questions which I'm combining. Korade Ajibade, forgive me if I'm pronouncing it incorrectly, is asking, what inspires you the most about Gandhiji's story and lifestyle? And Pankaj Rakesh is asking, lots of debate over Gandhiji's relevance in today's Kalyuga of politics. Is his spirit of ahimsa still relevant? So if you'd like to maybe talk about both in one comprehensive way.
So first, Akorade is Corey. I worked for her. She's here at the University of Texas at El Paso. She's from Nigeria. And Corey, I'm so glad you're on the call. And Pankajji, thank you also. There's so many stories. I think Corey likes to hear stories. When she took my positive deviance class this fall, she was forever encouraging me to tell stories. So I think she's asking what stories inspire me. So I don't know if I've told you this story, Corey. This is the story of Gandhiji. This is later on in his life when he's, Mahatma and Rashtrapita and all that. Just a few weeks before he was assassinated, when a woman came in prayer meeting and said, Bapu, tell my 4-year-old to stop eating sugar. And Bapu was like, oh, do you like to eat sugar? He says, yes. And she's, okay, sister, come back after a week. And she's like, come back after a week? Well, anyway, you come back after a week. She comes back after a week. And then Bapu says, oh yeah, well, yes. And then he tells the little kid, tomorrow try to eat just a little less sugar than you are eating now. And the day after that, try a little less. And the woman said, but Bapu, you could have told him exactly the same thing a week ago, right? And he said, yeah, you're right, my sister, I could have, but what you don't know is I also have a little sweet tooth. And first I had to see if it was possible to cut it down. And I have in the last week discovered that yes, you can cut it down a little bit at a time. Here's a Mahatma talking to a 4-year-old. And look at the consistency between the message and the messenger. And that's what made him Mahatma, right? Bapu. And for him, it came naturally that you don't advise anybody to do anything unless you can do it yourself. And look at the way we behave, right? We know how to solve all the problems of the world. without really deeply questioning where are we in the picture. And I think my favorite story though, Corey, this is for you and also for those who are tuning in, is, I don't know, I mean, Louis Fisher's book has many beautiful stories, but there's one. He talks about how he's sitting with Bapu, you know, Sabarmati, and Bapu is spinning his charka. And, you know, he was very punctual. In fact, if you go to Birla House on East January Lane, you can see Bapu's watch, right, which stopped at 5:17 p.m. He always carried a watch, and he was late for that prayer meeting when he was assassinated. So Fisher talks about, you know, Bapu spinning his charka, suddenly looks at his watch and he says, Fisher, it's time. And he says, oh yes, Bapu, Mohan, he called him Mohan. Mohan, it's time for us to go serve. You know, so at the ashram, they were responsible for serving food. And after you've served, then you get a chance to eat. So Bapu is sitting with Fisher. And, you know, somebody comes and puts a little rice and, you know, puts it on Bapu's plate and puts it on Fisher's plate. And then somebody comes and puts a little dal. And, you know, then somebody comes and puts a little vegetables and yogurt. And when they are putting vegetables on Fisher's plate, Fisher puts his hand up. And this is the conversation that happens. And, you know, I've sort of told this story so many times that I don't even need to look into Fisher's book. So when Fisher's hand goes up, Bapu says, Fisher, you don't like vegetables? And there's a pause, and Fisher says, Mohan, not the same mishmash of gourd and beans and boiled vegetables 3 days in a row. And then there's a little pause, and Bapu says, Fisher, add some salt, no? Add some nibu. And there's a long pause, and Fisher says, and kill the taste. You know, they had a bantering relationship. You want me to kill the taste by adding salt and nimbu? And Gandhi, you know, after a pause says, no, no, not kill it. Enhance it. Enhance it, Fisher. And then there's a long pause, and Fisher says, Mohan, you are so nonviolent in your creed that you don't even want to kill taste. And there's a long pause, and Bapu says, Fisher, if taste were the only thing that humans could kill, I would be okay with that. And so, you know, this is a deeply, it's a beautiful story because it's a conversation between an American journalist and the Mahatma. And this story is in the here and the now, where they are both fully present. And and Bapu had a wonderful sense of humor, right? You know, all this banter about, yeah, you know, not kill it, enhance it, you know, dalo thoda mirch masala, right? As he would say. And Pankajji's question, you know, I think I don't think Gandhi lends himself as an, I think he's deeply, deeply relevant if we choose to make him relevant. And you know, the picture is not somebody else should make him relevant. The question always is in the here and the now. How can I make him relevant in my life?
Yeah. Pallavi, like I said, I'll be the bad timekeeper. Sir, whether we meet you in person or we hear you online, dil nahi bharta hai. You know, one wants to listen to you, and every time you speak, there's some takeaway. You know, it's like, I need to do this now. This is where I went wrong. It's like this introspection through Gandhi that one sees. We are really blessed to have you amongst us. And I will take this opportunity to invite Pooja Chauhan ma'am. Ma'am has been on the webinar listening. And ma'am, welcome to the webinar. I know that you were there and you have been listening to Arvindji. Please, ma'am, it will be our honor if you could give you know, a befitting end to this conversation. And really nice to see you, ma'am.
Gauri, can you hear me?
Yes, ma'am. We can. Yes.
Professor Singhal, welcome back to Amity. And last time you were there with us on campus. And I can just remember the enthralling keynote address that you gave us. It was mesmerizing. And we've had a lot of conferences, we've had a lot of keynote speakers, but very rarely have we seen somebody jump off the stage and come and walk amongst the students into the aisles of the auditorium. And I really want to tell all our Amitians listening today, faculty, students, everyone, that that is the passion that Professor Singhal has. He's really a passionate person. And during this lovely 1 hour, we could all see that with what passion he's researched on this great person, Mahatma Gandhi. And I once again welcome you, Professor Arvind Singhal, and thank you so much for being here with all of us today. I also want to tell one or two very quick things. Pallavi and Gauri, you're very happy. I know that you've always wanted Professor Singhal to speak to our students, but last time when we met him, I think he had come a day after or maybe 2 days later, and we were very privileged that he had accepted our honorary professorship. But few things that I noticed, that when he came back, he remembered the name of each and every person, each and every faculty member, the students who were with him. And that is something that all of us need to learn. So Professor Singhal, that apart from your great research, your thorough knowledge, and your vivacious reader that you are, but there are so many qualities that you have. And with the kind of words that you've used today, one can only see that you yourself are so passionate about social justice, social work, upliftment of the poor. So once again, we are very grateful. Thank you so much for being here. And hopefully things may pass and we are again able to welcome you back on campus. Thank you so much, Professor Singhal. I once again thank you on behalf of our founder president, Dr. Ashok Chauhan, our chairperson, Dr. Mrs. Amita Chauhan, and our chancellor, Dr. Atul Chauhan. Thank you, and it is really lovely to see you again.
Thank you
so much, ma'am. Sir.
Thank you, Pooja-ji. Yeah, I just to say that in many ways, when I visited Amity, I felt this connection of the heart spirit. Yeah, the mind is okay. And I think in this conversation, as in the conversations that we've had in the past and the conversations we'd have in the future, there's a degree of mutual respect for the service that we are here to do as, educators, as provocateurs, as people who can maybe stimulate a little change in heart or mind or spirit. So thank you. I'm deeply honored.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, ma'am. And I wanted to also place on record the gratitude to Debjani. Thank you, Debjani, for doing the back-end work. Our regards to Professor Colonel R.K. Dargan, who is sitting, I'm imagining physically, listening to the lecture, to other faculty members. And sir, like ma'am has said, Amity has a deep relationship with you. We feel it from our hearts, and we wish to see you again soon. And so a lot of gratitude from us. And Pallavi, if you'd like to give some closing.
Gauri, before you end, of course, I want to appreciate both of you for getting such a stalwart again. And Professor Singhal, our work is still pending. I remember last time you had spoken to us about classroom teaching and how that is an area of your interest now, that how learning and teaching should really have the outcome. And as educators, I remember that we had really spoken at length about this. And Pallavi and Gauri, on your behalf, I would once again request Professor Singhal that if he maybe can address our faculty and teachers on this topic, because he's really an amazing person who's done so much work on how teachers should be able to teach in a way that it's translated well to students. So I would really request that he can give another session for our teachers, both at school. I think our chairperson would really like that, and university across, that how classroom teaching can really be optimum.
I accept.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you, Pooja ma'am, for your gracious presence and for your thoughtful words. And Professor Singhal, as Pooja ma'am pointed out, your positively deviant sessions are very, very inspiring. And, not just takeaways for the faculty, but I'm sure, when faculty imbibe some of these lessons, they will be able to transmit a lot of that approach to the students. So looking forward to having you back with us very, very soon. Thank you so much.
And thank you to all the participants for, a great response. Thank you. Thank you, ma'am. Good night.
Thank you.